private jets smell like nothing. That's what $100,000 buys you: the absolute absence of cheap cologne crying toddlers and recycled anxiety. Evelyn paid for absolute silence. So when she found a desperate man and a little girl sitting in the plush leather seats of her chartered Gulfstream, she didn't feel pity. She felt robbed. Kicking them to the wet tarmac was just a transaction. An hour later, plunging toward the earth in a screaming metal tube, she realized it was a lifeline. The rain in Teterboro was not cinematic. It was a cold, miserable drizzle that slicked the grey tarmac and smelled of damp asphalt, unburned hydrocarbons, and wet wool. Evelyn Croft stepped out of the back of the idling town car, ignoring the umbrella her driver scrambled to hold over her head. At 42, she had engineered a life where the weather was largely irrelevant, a minor logistical variable to be bypassed between climate-controlled boardrooms and climate-controlled vehicles. Her heels clicked against the metal stairs of the Gulfstream G650. She had a blinding ache behind her right eye, a tension headache born from a 12-hour hostile takeover negotiation that was currently fraying at the edges. She needed to be in Seattle by morning. She needed 4 hours of chemically induced sleep, a glass of Macallan, and utter, uncompromising silence. She stepped into the cabin. The flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, whose smile was usually lacquered onto her face, was standing frozen near the galley. Sarah's eyes darted nervously between Evelyn and the main cabin. Evelyn didn't ask. She simply pushed past the narrow galley partition. The cabin was supposed to be empty, a sanctuary of burled walnut cream leather and ambient lighting. Instead, the air smelled faintly of artificial strawberry and damp cotton. Sitting in the rear club seats, her seats was a man in a faded green flannel shirt. He looked to be in his early 30s, though the heavy bags under his eyes aged him. Next to him, buckled into the oversized leather captain's chair, was a little girl holding a sticky plastic bottle of red juice. She was kicking her scuffed sneakers rhythmically against the mahogany paneling of the bulkhead. Thud. 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 Evelyn stopped. She didn't gasp, she didn't shout. She just let the silence stretch cold and heavy until the man looked up. When he saw her, the color drained from his face. He scrambled to his feet, knocking his knee against the heavy folding table. "Oh, I'm sorry. Are you?" "They said someone else might be boarding, but I thought we had the back." Evelyn turned her head slowly to look at Sarah, who was practically vibrating with anxiety in the doorway. "Sarah, what is the meaning of this?" Her voice was a flat, uninflected line. It was the voice that had stripped executives of their pensions. "Ms. Croft, I am so sorry," Sarah stammered, gripping the edge of the galley counter. It was the charter desk. There was a catastrophic scheduling error. This was supposed to be an empty-leg repositioning flight. Mr. Smith booked it at a massive discount for a medical transport. But when your office called an hour ago and demanded a buyout of the jet, "I paid full charter rate to commandeer this aircraft." Evelyn interrupted the words, clipped and precise. "I did not pay to share it." Thomas Smith stepped forward. Up close, he smelled of stale coffee and desperation. "Ma'am, please. My name is Thomas. This is my daughter Lily." He gestured awkwardly to the girl who was now staring at Evelyn with wide, watering eyes. "She has a specialist appointment at Seattle Children's tomorrow morning. We've been on wait lists for months. We couldn't fly commercial because her immune system. The chemo." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. "I bought the empty leg seat. It was all I could afford. They said they could squeeze us in before you boarded." Evelyn looked at the girl. Lily's hair was thin, wispy beneath a knitted pink beanie. Her skin had a pale, translucent quality. It was a tragic sight. It was the kind of sight that prompted telethons and tearful donations. Evelyn felt absolutely nothing. Or rather, she felt a profound irritation at the messy, chaotic reality of other people's problems spilling onto her impeccably clean ledger. She did not have the emotional bandwidth for a pediatric tragedy tonight. She had 3,000 employees whose jobs depended on her clarity in the morning. She had a headache that was beginning to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat. "I am sympathetic to your situation, Mr. Smith," Evelyn said, looking him dead in the eye. It was a lie, but it was the polite thing to say. "However, I purchased the exclusive use of this aircraft. I am conducting highly confidential corporate business, and I require the entire cabin to sleep." "We won't make a sound," Thomas pleaded. His voice cracked, losing whatever remained of his dignity. He took a half-step closer, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Please, just let us sit in the back. I'll put headphones on her. You won't even know we're here. If we get off this plane, we miss the appointment. It took 6 months to get this slot." "Sarah," Evelyn said, not breaking eye contact with Thomas. "Call the terminal. Have them send the golf cart back. They need to disembark." Thomas blinked, stunned. "Are you serious? You have 14 empty seats on this plane. And I paid for every single one of them," Evelyn replied. "She's sick." He raised his voice, a sudden spike of anger breaking through his panic. Lily whimpered at the loud noise, clutching her juice bottle tighter. "Then the charter company will refund your discounted ticket, and you can use the money to book a commercial flight tomorrow," Evelyn said, turning her back on him to walk toward the forward section of the cabin. "It is not my responsibility to subsidize your logistics. Sarah, get them off. Now. Or I will call the FAA and report a security breach on my chartered aircraft." She sat down in the forward-facing seat, opened her leather briefcase, and pulled out her iPad. She didn't look back. She heard the shuffling of fabric. She heard Thomas's ragged, hitching breath. She heard the soft, confused voice of the little girl asking, "Daddy, aren't we going to the doctor?" "No, sweetie." Thomas's voice was a harsh, choked whisper. "The lady needs the whole plane. Let's go." As they walked past her down the narrow aisle, Evelyn didn't look up from her glowing screen. She saw Thomas's worn boots in her peripheral vision. He stopped beside her seat for a fraction of a second. She waited for him to spit on her, to curse her, to call her a monster. She was used to it. She had been called worse by men in tailored suits, but Thomas didn't say anything. The silence of his defeat was somehow heavier than a shout. He simply adjusted his cheap duffel bag on his shoulder, took his daughter's hand, and walked out into the cold rain. The heavy cabin door was pulled shut behind them, sealing with a thick pneumatic thud. Evelyn let out a long breath. She closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to her temples, waiting for the silence to comfort her. The silence of a G650 is a manufactured illusion. It isn't the absence of sound, but the deliberate dampening of chaos. Once the door sealed, the damp, noisy reality of New Jersey was instantly muted. The auxiliary power unit hummed with a low, expensive vibration. The air pushed through advanced HEPA filters immediately lost the smell of the wet tarmac and replaced it with a crisp, sterile neutrality. Sarah appeared from the galley, holding a crystal tumbler of sparkling water with a single wedge of lime. Her hands were shaking slightly. "Your water, Ms. Croft. We are cleared for taxi. Flight time to Boeing Field is approximately 4 hours and 40 minutes. Evelyn took the glass. "Thank you, Sarah. Do not disturb me unless the plane is on fire. I need to sleep." "Yes, ma'am." Evelyn took a sip. The lime was sharp, biting against her tongue. She unbuckled her trench coat and tossed it onto the adjacent seat. As she settled into the cream leather, she felt the massive Rolls-Royce BR725 engines spool up. The vibration traveled up through the floorboards into her expensive suede loafers and settled in her bones. The aircraft began to move. Evelyn stared out the window into the blackness. The rain streaked horizontally across the reinforced acrylic pane. As they pivoted onto the runway lights illuminated the edge of the private terminal. For a brief second, illuminated by a flashing amber strobe, she saw them. Thomas and Lily, standing under the small overhang of the terminal building, waiting for their luggage to be unloaded from the hold. Thomas had his coat wrapped around the girl, shielding her from the wind. He was staring directly at the plane. Evelyn broke eye contact first. She pulled down the pleated window shade, shutting out the runway, shutting out the rain, shutting out Thomas Smith. The takeoff thrust pushed her deep into her seat. The acceleration was a brutal, smooth force, pinning her against the leather. Within seconds, the wheels left the ground, and the heavy lumbering of the aircraft transformed into a sleek, slicing ascent. They punched through the dense cloud cover, trading the miserable weather of the East Coast for the freezing, frictionless void of the upper atmosphere. At 41,000 feet, the sky wasn't blue. It was a deep, bruised indigo bordering on black. Evelyn opened her laptop. Spreadsheets, risk assessments, redundancy protocols for the upcoming merger. She forced her eyes to scan the data, but the letters seemed to swim. Her headache had not abated. It had concentrated into a sharp needle right between her eyes. She stood up to stretch her legs and walked to the rear of the cabin, seeking a change of scenery. She paused by the seats where Thomas and Lily had been. On the polished walnut surface of the folding table, there was a small smudged fingerprint, a ring of condensation from the cheap plastic juice bottle. Evelyn reached into her pocket, pulled out a linen handkerchief, and wiped the smudge away. She rubbed the wood until it shone flawless and unblemished. "I am not a bad person," she told herself. It was an old mantra, worn smooth like a worry stone. "I am a pragmatist." The world was entirely composed of equations. You couldn't build an empire by letting sentimentality cloud your margins. If she had let Thomas stay, she would have been distracted. She would have worried about the kid crying or the father staring at her in gratitude. She would have felt obligated to engage to be human. And being human was exhausting. She had shut off her empathy years ago because it was a liability. The people who called her ruthless were the same people who profited from her dividends. They wanted the meat. They just didn't want to know how the sausage was made. Thomas Smith was friction. He was an unauthorized variable. Eliminating him from her environment was the correct logical choice. She went to the lavatory, splashed cold water on her face, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her skin looked grey under the bright LED lights. Her tailored Saint Laurent suit felt like armor that had grown too tight. "You did the right thing," she whispered to the mirror. She returned to her seat, reclined it fully into a bed, and pulled a cashmere blanket over her shoulders. She slipped her noise-cancelling headphones over her ears, flooding them with low-frequency white noise. She closed her eyes. The plane cruised smoothly. It was perfectly silent. It was perfectly empty. She was completely, utterly alone. Just the way she wanted it. She finally began to drift off the tension in her jaw, loosening her breathing, slowing to match the steady hum of the aircraft. It didn't start with a bang. It started with a subtle, sickening shift in frequency. Evelyn was hovering in that liminal space between waking and deep sleep when the white noise in her headphones seemed to stutter. Beneath her, the floorboards gave a strange metallic shudder. It wasn't the bouncy turbulence of rough air. It was a grinding, high-frequency vibration like a dentist's drill against a raw nerve. It rattled her molars. She pulled the headphones off, blinking into the dim cabin lighting. "Sarah," she called out, her voice thick with sleep. There was no answer. Then came the sound. It was a deep, mechanical groan, a sound of immense structural agony, like a massive steel bridge cable snapping underwater. It was followed instantly by a violent crack that echoed through the cabin with physical force. The Gulf Stream violently yawed to the left, a brutal whiplash motion that threw Evelyn hard against the side paneling. The crystal glass of water on the console beside her launched into the air, shattering against the ceiling. Water rained down on her face, shocking her fully awake. What the hell, she started, but the words were stolen from her lungs. A deafening roar consumed the world. The right engine had suffered an uncontained, catastrophic failure. A titanium fan blade had sheared off at 30,000 revolutions per minute, tearing through the engine, cowling, ripping through the wing structure, and violently puncturing the rear pressurized fuselage. The cabin depressurized in a fraction of a second. It wasn't like the movies. It wasn't a gentle whistling wind. It was a violent, explosive exhalation of the entire atmosphere inside the plane. The air turned instantly into a thick, freezing fog as the moisture condensed in the sudden drop in pressure. The temperature plummeted from a comfortable 70 degrees to 30 below zero in a heartbeat. Evelyn's ears screamed a sharp, stabbing pain that felt like ice picks driving into her eardrums. The air was violently sucked from her lungs. She gasped, her mouth wide open, but there was nothing to breathe. It felt like trying to inhale vacuum. Above her, the overhead compartments popped open. The yellow plastic cups of the oxygen masks deployed, tangling in their clear plastic tubing, swaying violently as the plane shuddered. The masks. Get the mask. Logic. Training. Protocol. Evelyn's brain screamed the commands, but her body wouldn't listen. Panic, raw and unadulterated, flooded her nervous system. She reached up her hands, trembling violently. Her fingers, usually so precise, felt like numb clubs. She grabbed the yellow cup and pulled it toward her face, but the elastic strap tangled in her hair. She tore at it, ripping a chunk of her own hair out, fighting the cheap piece of plastic. She jammed the cup over her nose and mouth and pulled the lanyard to start the oxygen flow. The smell hit her instantly, the sharp metallic scent of the oxygen generator, mixing with the acrid, terrifying stench of burning electrical wire and melted copper from the shattered engine. She breathed in her chest, heaving her eyes wide with animal terror. The plane was going down. It wasn't gliding, it was falling. The horizon outside her window tilted at a sickening, impossible angle. Gravity shifted, pressing her brutally down into her seat, then pulling her upward against her seatbelt as the pilots fought for control of the crippled, bleeding aircraft. Through the fog, she saw Sarah. The flight attendant was on the floor in the aisle, clinging to the base of a table, bleeding from her nose, her eyes rolled back. She hadn't reached a mask in time. Evelyn wanted to help her. She wanted to unbuckle her belt, reach out, drag the girl to an oxygen mask. But she couldn't move. She was paralyzed. The billionaire CEO, the apex predator of the corporate ecosystem, the woman who commanded thousands, was utterly, pathetically helpless. Her money couldn't buy the air back. Her stock options couldn't patch the hole in the fuselage. Her authority meant absolutely nothing to the laws of physics that were currently dragging her 30 tons of luxury metal out of the sky. The aircraft dropped another 1,000 feet in a gut-wrenching lurch. The airframe groaned, the metal screaming as it stressed beyond its limits. And in that moment of absolute freezing terror, staring at the empty seats in the back of the cabin through the dissipating fog, a realization hit Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. They would be sitting right there. If she had relented, if she had shown an ounce of mercy, if she had let Thomas and his sick little girl stay on the plane, they would be sitting in the rear club seats. Right next to the bulkhead, right where the turbine blade had sheared through the fuselage. She stared at the gaping hole in the back of the cabin, the edges jagged and peeled back, like a tin can exposing the terrifying, shrieking blackness of the night sky. The seats Thomas and Lily would have occupied were gone. Mangled, ripped apart, violently ejected into the stratosphere. If they had been on this plane, they would be dead. She had kicked a desperate father and a dying child off a flight into the freezing rain. She had acted with absolute self-serving cruelty. And by being a monster, she had saved their lives. The absurdity of it bubbled up in Evelyn's throat, mixing with the metallic taste of adrenaline and the cold oxygen. She let out a sound, a choked, hysterical sob that was swallowed entirely by the deafening roar of the dying plane. The altimeter on the bulkhead display flickered through the static. 30,000 feet, 28,000 feet, 24,000 feet. They were falling into the dark, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn Croft had absolutely no control. The descent was not a graceful glide. It was a brutal, mechanical brawl. The remaining Rolls-Royce engine screamed in asymmetrical overdrive, fighting the immense drag of the shredded right wing. Evelyn was pinned back, the G-forces pressing an invisible crushing weight against her chest. Ice began to form on the interior bulkheads. It crept across the burled walnut like a sudden aggressive fungus, freezing the condensation that had exploded into the cabin. The temperature was 20 below zero. Evelyn's breath crystallized instantly inside the plastic cup of her oxygen mask. Her hands gripping the armrests turned a mottled, bruised blue. Through the chaos of the plunging cabin, she looked at Sarah. The flight attendant was still on the floor 30 feet away, her body sliding a few inches with every violent yaw of the aircraft. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were grey. She was suffocating in the thin, freezing air. Evelyn's brain processed the variables with a cold, terrifying clarity. If I unbuckle, I will be thrown. If I lose my mask, I have 15 seconds of useful consciousness. If we crash and she is dead, I will have to open the emergency exit alone. It wasn't altruism that made Evelyn move. It was the frantic, calculating arithmetic of survival. She needed Sarah alive. Evelyn ripped her seatbelt open. The instant the metal clasp released, the plane lurched, throwing her hard onto the aisle floor. Her shoulder slammed into the carpeted deck, a flare of hot pain shooting up her neck. The carpet was stiff with frost. She dragged herself forward, her manicured fingernails tearing into the heavy weave of the fabric to find purchase. The wind roaring through the hole in the back of the plane was deafening. It whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. She kept one hand clamped firmly over her oxygen mask, breathing in sharp, terrified gasps of synthetic air. She crawled. It felt like hours, though it was only seconds. The plane banked sharply, and a heavy catering cart broke loose from the galley lock. It barreled down the aisle, a 200-pound metal missile. Evelyn flattened herself against the base of a seat just as the cart clipped her calf, crushing the muscle before it smashed into the forward bulkhead. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the mask and the wind. Dragging her injured leg, she reached Sarah. The young woman was limp, her pulse a faint flutter against the icy skin of her neck. Evelyn grabbed a dangling yellow mask from the overhead compartment above them, the plastic tubing stretching taut. She shoved it over Sarah's face, pulling the elastic strap tight around the back of her head, trapping a clump of blonde hair. "Breathe!" Evelyn snarled, her voice muffled raw. She slapped Sarah's cheek, not gently. A hard, stinging backhand. "Wake up and breathe." Sarah gasped, her chest heaving, as the pure oxygen flooded her lungs. Her eyes fluttered open, rolling wildly in panic. She reached up, clawing blindly at Evelyn's arms. "Hold on!" Evelyn shouted, hooking her arms under Sarah's armpits, bracing her own back against the heavy steel leg of the nearest club chair. The nose of the aircraft suddenly pulled up. The pilots were fighting bleeding altitude to gain airspeed, trying to flatten the trajectory before they hit the ground. The pitch change drove Evelyn and Sarah painfully into the floorboards. Out the shattered window, the blackness broke. It wasn't the soft glow of a city. It was the jagged, terrifying silhouette of the Appalachian ridgeline, rushing up to meet them at 200 miles an hour. "Brace!" Evelyn screamed, abandoning the oxygen mask, burying her face into Sarah's shoulder, squeezing her eyes shut. The impact did not happen all at once. It was a prolonged, excruciating sequence of destruction. First came the trees. The right wing clipped a massive pine, spinning the 80-foot aircraft sideways. The sound was apocalyptic, a sickening high-decibel tearing of aluminum and composite carbon, like a soda can being crushed in a giant's fist. The fuselage slammed into the earth. Evelyn was thrown violently forward, her grip on the chair leg slipping. The floor rippled beneath her. The forward bulkhead collapsed inward. Panels of mahogany and leather were stripped away, replaced by churning, mud-shattered branches, and raw, freezing earth pouring into the cabin. The G-forces were unimaginable. Evelyn felt her ribs flex and crack. The air was knocked from her lungs in a brutal explosive rush. Everything she knew, the smell of the cabin, the light, the cold evaporated into a concussive shockwave of pain, and then, mercifully, total blackness. Evelyn woke to the smell of dirt. It was a thick, organic smell, sharp with the scent of crushed pine needles and wet clay. Beneath it lay something chemical and terrifying, the heavy, cloying stench of Jet A fuel. She was suspended at an awkward angle. She opened her eyes, but the darkness was absolute. It pressed against her face, suffocating and heavy. She tried to inhale, and a jagged, burning agony erupted in her left side. Ribs, 3, maybe 4, broken. The clinical thought floated through the haze of her concussion. She tried to move her arms. Her right arm responded heavy and sluggish. Her left was pinned under something immovable. She blinked her vision, slowly adjusting to the faint, grey, ambient light bleeding through the ruined hull. The G650 was entirely unrecognizable. The luxurious tube of cream and walnut had been violently gutted. The ceiling was crushed downward, pinning the seats to the floor. The forward section, where the cockpit used to be, was simply gone, sheared off completely by a massive boulder. Cold, stinging rain blew through the ragged opening. Evelyn shifted her weight, ignoring the screaming pain in her chest, and yanked her left arm free. It wasn't pinned by metal. It had been buried under a mound of wet soil that had ploughed into the cabin during the slide. Her Saint Laurent jacket was soaked in mud and hydraulic fluid. She reached up, touching her forehead. Her fingers came away warm and sticky. Blood. It was pooling in her eyebrow, dripping slowly onto her cheek. "Sarah," Evelyn croaked. Her throat felt like it was coated in glass dust. No answer. Only the rhythmic, metallic tink-tink-tink of cooling engines somewhere in the dark, and the soft hiss of falling rain. Panic, primal and ugly, surged in Evelyn's chest. She pushed herself up onto her knees. Her ruined calf muscle protested, sending a fresh wave of nausea washing over her. She swallowed hard against the bile rising in her throat. "Sarah!" She yelled it this time, her voice cracking. She began to crawl through the debris. She pushed aside shattered iPad screens, shredded life vests, and the twisted metal framing of a $100,000 leather seat. She found Sarah near the mangled galley partition. The flight attendant was lying on her back, half covered by a sheet of torn acoustic insulation. Evelyn scrambled to her side, her hands frantically patting down Sarah's chest, feeling for a heartbeat. It was there, rapid and thready. Sarah's eyes were closed, her face pale in the gloom. Her right leg was trapped under the heavy frame of the espresso machine, which had torn loose from its mounts. "Sarah, wake up! Come on!" Evelyn slapped her cheeks again. Sarah groaned, a low, wet sound. Her eyelids fluttered. Cold. she whispered, her teeth beginning to chatter violently. So cold. I know. I'm going to get this off you. Evelyn grabbed the edge of the steel espresso machine. She planted her good foot against the floorboards, took a shallow, painful breath, and heaved. The metal didn't budge. Evelyn's ribs screamed. She fell back, gasping sweat mixing with the freezing rain on her face. She was a CEO. She directed mergers, commanded boardrooms, moved billions of dollars with a signature. But here in the mud and the dark, she lacked the sheer physical leverage to lift a 60-pound piece of metal. Her wealth was entirely impotent. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, caked in mud, the manicured nails chipped and packed with dirt. Beside her knee, half buried in the wet earth, was her leather briefcase. It had split open. A stack of highly confidential term sheets fluttered in the freezing wind. Useless pieces of paper dissolving into the mud. Okay. Evelyn muttered to herself, a frantic mantra. She scrambled around the debris, digging with her bare hands, feeling for anything she could use. Her fingers brushed against the heavy aluminum handle of the catering cart that had crushed her leg. She dragged the handle loose, wincing as the jagged edge sliced into her palm. Blood welled up, slippery and warm, but she ignored it. She jammed the aluminum bar under the base of the espresso machine, using a twisted piece of floor track as a fulcrum. When I lift you, pull your leg out. Do you understand me, Sarah? Sarah nodded weakly. Evelyn threw her entire body weight onto the bar. The pain in her ribs was blinding, a white-hot flash that made her vision swim. The machine groaned, lifting an inch, then two. "Pull!" Evelyn screamed. Sarah whimpered and dragged her leg backward. The moment she was clear, Evelyn let go. The machine slammed back down, missing Sarah's foot by a fraction of an inch. Evelyn collapsed into the mud, her chest heaving, tears of pure agony leaking from the corners of her eyes. Sarah was crying now, clutching her leg. "The pilots," she sobbed. "Captain Miller. Did they?" Evelyn looked toward the jagged hole where the cockpit had been. There was nothing out there but the dark silhouettes of shattered trees and the driving rain. "They're gone," Evelyn said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, an automatic defense mechanism slamming into place. She dragged herself closer to Sarah and pulled the shredded acoustic insulation over both of them, trying to trap whatever body heat they had left. The temperature was dropping. The wind howled through the ruined fuselage, carrying the distinct, terrifying smell of aviation fuel. If a single spark caught, they would burn alive. Evelyn lay in the dark, shivering violently, her broken ribs grinding with every breath. She stared up at the crushed ceiling. Through a gap in the torn metal, she could see a single indifferent star. Her mind, unable to cope with the pain, and the freezing mud retreated to the only thing it could process. It projected an image onto the darkness. Thomas Smith. Lily's pink beanie. The smudged fingerprint on the walnut table. She had bought the whole plane. She had bought the silence. And this freezing, agonizing hell was exactly what she had paid for. The rescue helicopters didn't arrive until dawn. Evelyn heard them before she saw them. The heavy, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of rotor blades chopping through the freezing mountain air. Then came the blinding, invasive beams of searchlights, cutting through the dense pine canopy, sweeping over the twisted silver wreckage of the Gulf Stream. The paramedics descended on ropes, shouting to each other in clipped professional tones. When they reached the fuselage, they found Evelyn conscious, her arms locked tightly around Sarah in a macabre embrace, both women covered in mud-blood and frost. The extraction was a blur of excruciating pain and blinding lights. Evelyn remembered the sharp pinch of a morphine needle piercing her thigh through her ruined trousers. She remembered being strapped to a rigid backboard, hoisted into the belly of a Coast Guard Jayhawk, the deafening roar of the engines, finally replacing the terrifying silence of the woods. She didn't speak. She just stared at the ribbed ceiling of the helicopter until the morphine dragged her down into a heavy, dreamless dark. 72 hours later, Evelyn opened her eyes to the sterile yellow glow of a hospital room in Pittsburgh. The smell of wet earth and jet fuel was gone, replaced by the sharp chemical tang of iodine and bleached cotton. She lay perfectly still, cataloguing the damage. Her chest was bound tightly. A thick plaster cast encased her left calf. An IV line snaked into the back of her hand, feeding a steady drip of synthetic painkillers into her bloodstream. The door opened with a soft click. Harrison, her chief of staff, stepped into the room. He was wearing a flawless navy suit. His hair was perfectly parted. He looked entirely out of place in the room of a woman who had just fallen out of the sky. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his face a mask of carefully calibrated professional concern. "Evelyn," he said softly, "it is good to see you awake." "Harrison," she croaked. Her voice sounded like it belonged to an old woman. "Give me the damage report." Harrison permitted himself a tight, strained smile. Even now she was asking for the ledger. The board convened an emergency session yesterday. Stock dipped 4% when the news broke, but stabilized when we released the statement that you were expected to make a full recovery. The acquisition in Seattle is on hold, but they are willing to extend the deadline. Sarah, she is in the ICU. Severe frostbite compound fracture in her leg and internal bleeding. But she is stable. She will survive. Harrison paused, shifting his weight. Captain Miller and First Officer Davis did not. Evelyn closed her eyes. She felt a dull, heavy ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her broken ribs. 2 men dead. 2 men who had fought a 30-ton metal coffin to the ground just well enough to keep her alive. The FAA and NTSB are already crawling all over the wreckage. Harrison continued pulling a tablet from his leather portfolio. Preliminary reports indicate an uncontained failure of the right engine. A titanium fan blade sheared off, punctured the fuselage, and caused rapid decompression. Harrison tapped the screen and held it out to her. But that is not what the media is focusing on. Evelyn frowned, trying to sit up, wincing as the pain flared. She took the tablet. A news broadcast was playing. The chyron across the bottom read, "Miracle in Teterboro. Father and dying daughter spared from doomed flight." Evelyn stared at the screen. The sound was off, but she didn't need to hear it. There was Thomas Smith sitting in a brightly lit television studio. He looked cleaner than he had on the plane, wearing a new button-down shirt. Sitting on his lap was Lily, still wearing her pink beanie, holding a new stuffed animal. Evelyn reached out with a trembling, bruised finger and tapped the unmute icon. "We were so angry," Thomas was saying, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes red-rimmed. The female anchor leaned in, wearing a face of practiced empathy. "We were desperate. I begged the woman, the CEO who chartered the plane, to let us stay. When she threw us off, I thought it was the worst thing that could ever happen. I thought we were going to miss Lily's surgery." He swallowed hard, looking down at his daughter. He kissed the top of her beanie. "But we booked a red-eye commercial flight the next morning. We made the appointment. And then while we were in the waiting room, we saw the news on the TV." Thomas looked directly into the camera, a tear spilling over his cheek. "That plane went down exactly where we would have been sitting. The investigator said the rear section was completely destroyed mid-air. The anchor placed a gentle hand on his arm. She saved your lives." "She did." Thomas nodded, weeping openly now. "I don't know why she kicked us off. I don't know what was in her heart. But she is our guardian angel. If I could speak to her right now, I would just say, thank you. You gave my little girl her life." Evelyn hit the mute button. The silence in the hospital room crashed down around her, suffocating and heavy. She handed the tablet back to Harrison. Her hand was shaking violently. "It's a PR miracle, Evelyn," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The press is painting you as a tragic hero, a woman who made a tough call that inadvertently saved a dying child. The narrative is incredible. We are already drafting a statement. We're going to set up a charitable foundation in Lily's name. Get out!" Harrison blinked, stunned. "Excuse me." "Get out, Harrison," Evelyn said, her voice rising raw and jagged. "Get out of this room right now." Harrison nodded, slowly, smoothing his tie. I'll let you rest. The doctors said you might experience some emotional whiplash. I will be in the hall." He turned and left the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind him. Evelyn stared at the blank wall opposite her bed. Guardian angel. She felt sick. A deep, wretched nausea twisted in her gut, burning worse than the fractures in her chest. She hadn't saved them. She had looked at a desperate man and a sick child and felt nothing but irritation. She had kicked them out into the freezing rain because they were an inconvenience. She had valued an hour of silence over their misery. She was a monster. She had acted with absolute, unadulterated selfishness, and the universe, in its dark, twisted, cynical humor, had taken her ugliest moment and forged it into a miracle. She had done the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, and it had resulted in a profound, life-saving good. She was alive because the men up front had died. Thomas and Lily were alive because she had been cruel. The ledger was unbalanced. The equations didn't make sense anymore. Evelyn Croft, the woman who controlled everything, realized with terrifying clarity that she controlled absolutely nothing. She brought her bruised, trembling hands to her face, and for the first time since she was a child, she wept. She wept for the pilots. She wept for the terror in the dark. But mostly she wept because she was utterly, unforgivably broken, and the world was praising her for it. Recovery was not a montage. It was a grueling, humiliating slog measured in millimeters of bone growth and the nauseating intervals between Vicodin doses. For 6 weeks, Evelyn's universe was reduced to a private rehabilitation suite overlooking the Monongahela River. The room smelled perpetually of lemon-scented industrial cleaner and the sour, metallic tang of her own sweat. The silence she had once paid millions to curate was now a torment. Without the distraction of board meetings or quarterly earnings reports, the silence became a vacuum, and the memories rushed in to fill it. Every time she closed her eyes, the temperature in the room plummeted. She would hear the high-frequency grind of the failing turbine, followed by the apocalyptic roar of depressurization. She would wake up gasping, her fingers clawing at the high thread count bedsheets, searching for the cheap plastic tubing of an oxygen mask. Harrison visited every Tuesday and Thursday. He brought financial summaries, legal briefings regarding the NTSB investigation, and the relentless, suffocating PR strategy. "They want to do a prime-time special," Harrison said, on a rainy Tuesday in November, dropping a thick manila folder onto the pristine glass of her bedside table. A sit-down interview. Barbara Walters style. You, Thomas Smith, and the little girl. We can control the questions. It will permanently cement this guardian angel narrative. It's bulletproof, Evelyn. The board loves it. Evelyn stared at her left leg, which was currently encased in a grey walking boot. The compound fracture had required 3 titanium screws. She could feel them on cold days, a dull, aching reminder of the metal cart that had crushed her calf. "I am not doing a television interview, Harrison," she said, her voice flat, devoid of its former booming authority. It sounded thin, scraped raw by the screaming wind of the crash. Evelyn, the public goodwill is unprecedented. You have a 92% approval rating. You are a corporate executive with the poll numbers of a war hero. We cannot waste this capital." Evelyn slowly turned her head to look at him. Harrison smelled of expensive bergamot aftershave and dry-cleaned wool. He looked entirely insulated from the physical realities of the world. He was still living in the spreadsheet. "2 men died, Harrison. They were ripped to pieces in a cockpit while you were sleeping in your penthouse. I am not going to sit on a soundstage and smile at a camera to boost our stock price." Harrison sighed a sound of practiced patience. The settlement with the Miller and Davis families was generous, very generous. They are taken care of. And as for Thomas Smith, you did save them. That is a fact. "It is a consequence." Evelyn snapped a sudden flash of heat rising in her chest, aggravating her healing ribs. "It is not a fact of intent. I threw them off because I found them repulsive, because they were loud and poor and inconvenient. I did it because I am a vicious, self-centered bitch. And if that fan blade had held together, I would have landed in Seattle, closed a $3 billion merger, and never thought about them again." Harrison didn't blink. He just adjusted his cuffs. "Intent doesn't matter to the market. Only outcomes. You're emotional. We'll revisit this next week." After he left, Evelyn asked the nurse for a wheelchair. She wheeled herself down the long linoleum-tiled corridor to the physical therapy wing. The rubber tires squeaked faintly against the polished floor. It was a pathetic small sound. Sarah was there. The flight attendant was sitting on a padded table wearing grey sweatpants. Her right leg was a mess of surgical scars and atrophied muscle secured in a heavy jointed brace. A physical therapist was slowly bending her knee, and Sarah's face was pale tight with agony. Evelyn parked the wheelchair near the door and watched. She noticed the way Sarah gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her breathing shallow and ragged. She remembered the sheer physical force it had taken to lift the espresso machine. She remembered the smell of Sarah's blood, mixing with the aviation fuel. The therapist finished the session, and Sarah slumped forward, exhausted. She looked up and saw Evelyn. The silence between them was heavy, fundamentally altered from the employer-employee dynamic they had shared for 3 years. There was no lacquered smile on Sarah's face now. There was just a weary, raw acknowledgement. Evelyn wheeled herself forward. "How is the pain?" "Manageable." Sarah lied. Her voice was raspy. The freezing air had permanently damaged her vocal cords. "They say I might be able to walk without the cane by spring." "But you won't fly again." It wasn't a question. Sarah looked down at her hands. "No, I lose my balance too easily. The FAA Medical Board already pulled my certification." Evelyn reached into the pocket of her silk robe and pulled out a thick envelope. She handed it to Sarah. "What is this?" "It's a trust, held in your name at Chase," Evelyn said, keeping her eyes fixed on Sarah's scarred hands. "It is enough to cover your medical bills, your physical therapy, and your salary for the next 30 years. It is completely independent of the corporate settlement. It is from me." Sarah stared at the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't cry. She just looked at Evelyn with a profound, terrifying emptiness. "Does this make you feel better, Ms. Croft?" Sarah asked quietly. The question hit Evelyn harder than the catering cart had. It was a precision strike. "No," Evelyn answered honestly. The word tasted like ash. "No, it doesn't." "Good," Sarah said, sliding the envelope onto the table beside her without looking at it again. "Because I wake up every night smelling burning wire. Captain Miller gave me this job when I was sleeping in my car. He was going to walk me down the aisle next year." Sarah looked directly into Evelyn's eyes. "Money doesn't fix the dark, Miss Croft. We both know that now." Evelyn nodded slowly. She backed the wheelchair away, reversing out of the room. She retreated down the hallway, the squeak of the rubber tires sounding like a mockery in the quiet corridor. She returned to her room, maneuvered herself into the bed, and stared at the ceiling. The ledger was burned. The math of her life was fundamentally irreparably broken. You couldn't buy absolution. You couldn't write a check to erase the smell of the mud or the freezing wind or the fact that she was alive by the sheer dumb luck of sitting in the front of a metal tube instead of the back. 4 months after the crash, Evelyn Croft walked through the automatic sliding doors of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She walked with a cane, a sleek black carbon fiber rod with a textured rubber grip. It clicked rhythmically against the scuffed terrazzo floor. Click, step, click, step. For the first time in 15 years, Evelyn had flown commercial. It was first class, certainly, but it was still a tube filled with 300 other human beings. It was a sensory assault. The smell of stale pretzels, the sickly sweet odor of floor wax, the crying of an exhausted toddler 3 rows back. The air was recycled heavy with the expelled breath of strangers. Before the crash, this environment would have induced a low-level panic attack, a furious demand for her assistant to fix the logistics. Today, Evelyn simply gripped the armrests and endured it. The noise, the smells, the agonizing proximity of other people, it was friction. It was the messy, chaotic reality of the world she had spent a fortune trying to rise above. She had left Harrison and her security detail in New York. She wore a simple charcoal turtleneck dark jeans and a trench coat to hide the heavy brace on her calf. She looked ordinary. She looked older. The grey at her temples, which her stylist usually chased away every 3 weeks, was now entirely visible. She took a taxi, not a black car, but a battered yellow Prius that smelled faintly of cheap vanilla air freshener and old cigarette smoke, to a small independent coffee shop near Pike Place Market. It was raining. A cold, aggressive Pacific Northwest downpour that slicked the pavement and made the neon signs bleed red and blue across the asphalt. Evelyn pushed open the door of the cafe. A bell jingled violently overhead. The air inside was thick with steam, the bitter aroma of roasted coffee beans and damp wool. It was crowded, loud, and thoroughly chaotic. She scanned the room and found him sitting in a back booth. Thomas Smith looked different. The heavy bags under his eyes were still there, but the manic, desperate energy he had radiated on the tarmac in Teterboro was gone. He wore a heavy canvas jacket, and he was staring into a ceramic mug, tracing the rim with his thumb. Evelyn walked over. The cane clicked against the wooden floorboards. Thomas looked up. He froze, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the cane, the grey hair, the hollowed-out look in her cheeks. He recognized her, but barely. "Mr. Smith," she said, her voice quiet under the din of the espresso machine. "Mrs. Croft," he replied. He didn't stand up. He just gestured to the empty wooden chair opposite him. Evelyn sat down, slowly, wincing as the titanium screws in her leg objected to the damp cold. She leaned the cane against the table. They sat in silence for a long moment. A waitress with a pierced septum dropped a glass of water in front of Evelyn, the ice clinking loudly. "Where is Lily?" Evelyn asked finally. "She's at the clinic," Thomas said, his voice guarded. "Her mother is with her. The surgery was successful. The marrow transplant took. She's going to live. The doctors say she has a 90% chance of full remission." Evelyn closed her eyes and let out a slow breath. A knot in her chest, a knot she hadn't realized was pulled so tight, loosened just a fraction. "I am glad. I am truly glad." Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the sticky wooden table. "Why did you call me Miss Croft?" Your lawyer sent a check. A massive check. We don't need any more money. We're fine." "I didn't come to give you money," Evelyn said. She picked up the glass of water. The condensation on the outside was cold, biting into her fingertips. It grounded her. "I came to tell you the truth." Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing. "The truth about what?" Evelyn looked around the cafe, at the college students typing frantically on laptops, at the old men arguing over a newspaper, at the messy, loud, beautiful, terrifying reality of human existence. "I watched your interview," Evelyn said, bringing her eyes back to Thomas. "I heard you call me a guardian angel." "You saved her life," Thomas said, firmly defensively. "If you hadn't kicked us off, she would have been sitting right where the fuselage tore open." "I know," Evelyn said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the noise of the cafe. "But you need to know why I did it." Thomas stared at her, waiting. "I didn't look at you and see a father in pain. I didn't look at Lily and see a sick child who needed help," Evelyn said, forcing herself to maintain eye contact, forcing herself to endure the disgust that would inevitably bloom in his eyes. "I looked at you and I saw a problem. I saw noise. I saw an inconvenience that was going to ruin my sleep. I bought that jet because I believed my comfort was worth more than your daughter's life. I kicked you off because I am a selfish, arrogant woman who had stopped viewing other people as human beings." The words hung in the space between them, heavy and toxic. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. "I am not an angel, Mr. Smith. I am the villain of your story. The only reason your daughter is alive is because my cruelty happened to intersect with a catastrophic mechanical failure. It was an accident of physics." Nothing more. She waited for the explosion. She waited for him to throw his hot coffee in her face, to scream at her, to validate the crushing, suffocating guilt she had carried for 4 months. She needed him to hate her, so the world's false praise would stop burning a hole in her conscience. Thomas looked at her. He looked at the cane. He looked at the trembling of her hands. He took a slow sip of his coffee. He set the mug down. "I know," Thomas said softly. Evelyn blinked, stunned. You know. Ms. Croft, I'm a forklift driver at a warehouse. I deal with executives like you every time they come down to complain about inventory metrics. I know how you look at people who make $20 an hour. I knew exactly why you threw us off that plane." "Then why?" Evelyn asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you go on television and say those things? Why did you make me a saint?" Thomas sighed, rubbing a tired hand over his face. "Because the world is a dark, random, terrifying place. A fan blade snaps and 2 pilots die. A little girl gets a random mutation in her cells, and she spends 3 years vomiting in a hospital bed." He looked out the window at the driving rain. "If I go on TV and say, 'A billionaire treated us like garbage, and then by sheer dumb luck we didn't die,' it just proves that everything is chaos," Thomas said, turning his gaze back to Evelyn. His eyes were hard, but not unkind. "I needed a reason, Miss Croft. I needed to believe that somebody was looking out for Lily, even if I had to invent the narrative myself. I made you an angel because I couldn't survive believing the universe was just a cold, rolling set of dice." The revelation struck Evelyn with a physical weight. He hadn't been delusional. He had been desperate. He had weaponized her actions to create a shield of meaning against a meaningless tragedy. "It's a lie," Evelyn whispered. "It's a survival tactic," Thomas corrected. "Just like you buying a private jet so you wouldn't have to look at sick people. We all do what we have to do to get through the night." They sat together for another 30 minutes. They didn't speak much. They just shared the space, 2 people permanently tethered together by a shared avoidance of death. When Thomas finally stood up to leave, he zipped up his canvas jacket. "I appreciate you coming here, Miss Croft," he said. "It takes guts to look someone in the eye and tell them you're a monster." "Does it help?" Evelyn asked, her hand resting on the carbon fiber grip of her cane. "No," Thomas said honestly. "But it makes you human, and frankly that's an improvement." He gave her a brief, curt nod, turned and walked out of the cafe, disappearing into the grey Seattle rain. Evelyn sat alone in the booth for a long time. The coffee grew cold. The noise of the cafe washed over her, the clattering plates, the hissed milk, the overlapping conversations. It was deafening. It was chaotic. It was beautiful. When she finally stood up, her leg throbbed fiercely. She leaned her weight onto the cane and limped out the door into the rain. She didn't call a cab. She walked. She walked down the steep, slick pavement of Pike Street, letting the freezing rain soak into her expensive wool coat. It matted her hair to her forehead. It dripped down her neck, sending shivers down her spine. She felt the cold. She felt the ache in her bones. She felt the uneven texture of the concrete beneath her boots. For the first time in 2 decades, she wasn't trying to control the environment. She was simply existing within it. Evelyn Croft didn't experience a magical transformation. She didn't give away all her billions, and she didn't become a bleeding-heart philanthropist. She was still a pragmatist. She still understood the brutal math of the world. But when she returned to New York, she walked into the glass-walled boardroom of her company, looked at Harrison, and handed him her resignation. "I am stepping down as CEO," she announced to the stunned board of directors. Her voice wasn't a roar. It was a quiet, immovable stone. "I will remain on the board, but I am liquidating my majority voting shares." "Evelyn, you can't be serious," Harrison had stammered, his polished veneer cracking. The merger will proceed without me," Evelyn said, leaning on her cane. "I am tired, Harrison, and I have found that the air up here is entirely too thin." She walked out of the boardroom, leaving the silence behind her. She moved out of the penthouse. She bought a brownstone in Brooklyn. It was expensive, yes, but it was on a noisy street. There was a bus stop on the corner. The brakes of the M15 bus squealed violently every 15 minutes, day and night. On a humid evening in July, a year after the crash, Evelyn sat on the front stoop of her brownstone. The stone was still warm from the afternoon sun. The air smelled of hot asphalt exhaust fumes and the sweet artificial scent of a nearby halal cart. A teenager walked by a heavy boombox, blasting bass-heavy hip-hop that rattled Evelyn's chest cavity. A stray dog barked at a passing siren. The city was screaming a chaotic, disorganized symphony of millions of people grinding against each other in the desperate pursuit of survival. Evelyn closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought of Captain Miller and First Officer Davis buried under the earth. She thought of Sarah limping through a grocery store with a permanent ache in her knee. She thought of Thomas and Lily navigating the terrifying, fragile reality of remission. She thought of the gaping black hole in the fuselage, the freezing wind, and the absolute lack of control. The ledger was unbalanced. It always would be. There was no equation that could make it right, no amount of money that could buy back the dead or erase the guilt. But as the M15 bus pulled up to the corner, its air brakes hissing with a loud mechanical sigh, Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't retreat inside. She sat there on the warm stone, gripping her cane, and let the noise wash over her. She was imperfect. She was raw. She was a woman who had bought the sky and found out it was empty. But down here in the dirt, the mud and the deafening noise of the living, she could finally breathe. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. This channel thrives on bringing you raw, unfiltered stories that explore the darkest and most human parts of our nature. What did you think of Evelyn's choice? Was Thomas right to lie for his own survival? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a complex thriller. And subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the messy, chaotic reality of life.